Hello, class. Today I'm going to talk to you about the mid to late 1960s and early 1970s, the era in American history of Vietnam, the backlash, and Richard Nixon. So Lyndon Johnson continued to escalate in Vietnam from 1966 through 68, the escalation he'd begun in 65. Troop numbers escalated. When Johnson took office, there were about 17,000 American troops in Vietnam. By the end of 1965, there were 184,000. By the end of 66, the number was 450,000 American troops. And at its peak, in early 1968, the number of American troops in Vietnam reached over 536,000. Well over 500,000 American troops in the small country of Vietnam. American casualties, meaning killed, wounded, hospitalized, or missing, increased along with the escalation of troop numbers. From 2,500 casualties in 1965 to a total of 33,000 by the end of 66, 130,000 and 130,000 by the end of 68. By the end of the war, the U.S. would lose over 57,000 troops killed in the war. The war effort was powered by the draft. In 1966, 340,000 young men were drafted into the armed services versus about 100,000 a year from 1960 to 1964. By 1968, 1/3 of all 20-year-olds in the country were in the military service, many of them in Vietnam, serving in Vietnam. Unlike in the Korean conflict and World War II, however, in which all classes of society had been represented rather proportionally in combat, in Vietnam, there was considerable truth to the axiom that the war was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. Roughly 80% of the troops hailed from poor or working class backgrounds, or 4 in 5 of the GIs. This was largely due to the fact that for the bulk of the war, there were numerous ways for middle and upper middle class young men to avoid service. The leading one was simply to continue attending college or grad school and thus receive a deferment. That means was relatively unavailable to the poor, many of whom were minorities. In 1965, black soldiers accounted for 24% of all casualties in Vietnam, nearly double the black percentage of the overall U.S. population, which was about 12%. The class dimension of war service tended to cause bitterness among the overrepresented working class and deepening its resentment of the spoiled rich kids on college campuses who participated in anti-war demonstrations. It also led to further fragmentation, both in the Democratic Party of Lyndon Johnson and in the country at large. When the outlaw motorcycle gang, the Hells Angels, beat up unpatriotic anti-war protesters in Berkeley, California in the fall of 1965, public sentiment appears to have been strongly with the Angels. And when, several years later, in May of 1970, a large group of approximately 200 New York City construction workers, upset that the flag at City Hall had been lowered to half-mast to honor the 4 students killed during the anti-war protests at Kent State University, they plunged into the crowd in front of City Hall and began beating people with their construction helmets. Around 70 people were injured in the melee. Following that, President Nixon invited their Union leader, Peter Brennan, to the White House, where Brennan presented Nixon with a construction helmet. As the war wore on, with mounting casualties and government expenditures, military spending went from $49.6 billion in 1965 to $80.5 billion in 1968. The American public's support began to wane. LBJ's repeated assurances about the closeness of victory and the relative success of the war effort came to ring hollow. By October of 1967, while a majority of Americans still supported the war effort, only 28% approved of LBJ's handling of it. In August of 1968, a few months after the Tet Offensive of January and February of that year, and the Tet Offensive was a public relations disaster for the Johnson administration. By August, public support for the war effort dropped below 50% for the first time in the war, with 53% of Americans saying it had been a mistake to send troops to Vietnam. That percentage would grow to 55% in 1969 and 60% by 1971. Turning to the pivotal year of 1968. 1968 was a watershed year in American history. A year of violence and turmoil, a year in which the liberal consensus that had largely governed since 1933 fell apart, a year when much of the hope and optimism that had characterized the United States since the end of World War II disintegrated, a year of loss of faith in the Vietnam War effort, a year of assassination of, most prominently, of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. The year began with the Tet Offensive, a major offensive by the National Liberation Front, LF, and NLF, and the Viet Cong, the VC. Begun on January 30th, the Tet Offensive coincided with a Vietnamese holiday marking the start of the Lunar New Year. In the offensive, the U.S. Embassy at Saigon was attacked, and simultaneously the VC and the NLF hit 5 cities, 64 district capitals, 36 provincial capitals, and 30 hamlets. For a national public in America that had just heard from the top U.S. general in Vietnam, William Westmoreland, that there was light at the end of the tunnel in the Vietnam conflict. Westmoreland had said that at the end of '67 on a tour he did of the U.S. Tet seemingly put the lie to all the false claims Johnson and his top military advisors had made throughout the war, and had been making for years, and began to significantly erode faith in the war effort. This despite the fact that after initial losses, the U.S. military fought well and effectively, launching a successful counteroffensive over the next 3 weeks that killed more than 5,000 enemy soldiers. On March 31st of 1968, following a strong showing by anti-war candidate Senator Eugene McCarthy, who garnered 42% of the vote in the primary, in the New Hampshire primary, and the conclusions of a panel of establishment wise men that included Dean Acheson, General Ridgway, and Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, that Vietnam was essentially an unwinnable sinkhole, Johnson appeared on national television to announce a partial bombing halt in the North, a willingness to engage in peace talks, and the bombshell that he would under no circumstances be a candidate for president that year. On April 4th, Martin Luther King Jr., the great civil rights leader, was killed in Memphis, Tennessee, shot by a white supremacist assassin, James Earl Ray, who would not be caught for many weeks. King's assassination touched off massive riots in numerous cities around the U.S., major cities. Black areas of those cities went up in flame. Also in April, radical students shut down the campus at Columbia University in New York City, sparking a more violent stage of campus anti-war protests. Between 1968 and 1970, more than 150 violent protests would take place at American universities. Protests in which ROTC buildings were attacked and campuses were closed. On June 5th, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, who was gaining in the polls on Senator McCarthy, and shortly after his win in the California primary, was gunned down at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles and killed. In late August, at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who had not run in the primaries and was anathema to the anti-war folk, became the presumptive nominee with the death of Kennedy and the lackluster campaign of McCarthy, and most importantly, with the support of Lyndon Johnson and the party establishment. Mayor Richard Daley, a Johnson-Humphrey loyalist, detested the anti-war folk and told them that they would not be welcome in Chicago. Daley essentially turned his police force loose on the anti-war protesters. Following Humphrey's nomination on the first ballot on August 28th, the police, acting on Mayor Daley's orders, took off their badges, charged into the protesters, hitting them with clubs and shouting, "Kill, kill, kill." It was a shocking image that was beamed on all over the country on national TV. The Humphrey Muskie ticket that left Chicago was badly wounded. Alabama Governor George Wallace, running for president once again, this time as an independent, of course appealed to Southern segregationists, as he always did, but he also appealed to many in the North, including many blue-collar whites. With Wallace's pointed contempt for liberal elites, government bureaucrats, hippies, anti-war college students, and his equally pointed support for good, hard-working Americans who held to traditional values, Wallace was a force to be reckoned with in 1968. A new dealer when it came to labor issues and government spending, Wallace was firmly against the social experimentation of LBJ's Great Society programs, and also staunchly opposed to the many social changes of the 1960s, such as long hair, drug use, anti-war protest, civil rights for blacks, and feminism. Wallace, more effectively than any other politician of the era, tapped the rising forces of social backlash against the claims of group rights by blacks and other minority groups, excessive libertinism of spoiled young people on college campuses and elsewhere, and government planning by Washington bureaucrats. Had he been the candidate of one of the major parties in 1968, Wallace might well have become president. Richard Nixon, the former vice president, and a political animal to his core, recognized that the struggles of Johnson in 66 through 68 and the rising forces of backlash could work to his advantage in 1968. Nixon decided to re-enter politics he'd been on a hiatus since his loss in the race for governor of California in 1962. A traditional centrist Republican, Nixon was a well-known and comfortable fixture for many members of the GOP. In 1968, Nixon essentially ran a genteel version of Wallace's campaign, attempting to appeal to many of the same voters that Wallace was courting. Nixon appealed to a desire for law and order, which he stressed. He upheld traditional values of patriotism and hard work, criticized Johnson for the excesses of the excesses of the Great Society, and said he had a secret plan, a la Eisenhower for Korea, to end the war. And he adopted a Southern strategy that emphasized his relative softness on civil rights. Nixon was anti-busing of black students into white school districts and anti the busing of white students into black school districts for the purposes of equalization and fulfillment of Brown v. Board. Nixon also famously appealed to the silent Americans, the so-called silent majority who didn't protest and weren't part of the youth movement in America at the time. That was very unpopular with many Americans. Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, was hamstrung by his loyalty to Johnson. And Johnson did relatively little to help the Humphrey campaign. Humphrey was trailing Nixon badly in the polls. He was down by at least 15 points when, on September 30th, in a speech in Salt Lake City, he removed the vice presidential seal from his lectern and delivered a speech that separated his position on Vietnam from that of the Johnson administration. Humphrey said he'd be willing to stop the bombing of North Vietnam in order to foster dialogue at the Paris peace talks, which were ongoing at the time, between the North and South Vietnamese. The speech lifted Humphrey's campaign, and the campaign gained lots of ground in the final weeks, reassembling much of the old New Deal coalition of labor, blacks, and liberals that had been so successful for Democrats for the past generation. By election day, the race was virtually a dead heat. Shortly before the election, President Johnson ramped up his peace efforts. Johnson was very much hoping to conclude a peace deal before the election so that he could say that he had ended the Vietnam War on his watch. On October 31st, Johnson announced a bombing halt and a willingness to talk with NLF representatives in Paris. Progress appeared to be being made. But then General Thieu, the leader of South Vietnam, essentially spiked the negotiations, saying he would not bargain with the NLF. As it turns out, however, Richard Nixon had a hand in Thieu's walkout. Working through an intermediary, Anna Chenot, the widow of the former Flying Tigers war hero Claire Chenot, Nixon urged Thieu to hold his ground and promised him a better deal if he, Nixon, was elected president. President Johnson learned of Nixon's actions and felt them to be treasonous, and even considered contesting the election or pushing Humphrey to contest the election, which Nixon had just won by a very bare majority, or a very bare plurality, rather. But Johnson decided against it over fears of divisions to the country. Nixon, as I just said, was very, very narrowly elected. Essentially, in the popular vote, it was a tie, 43 to 43%, with Wallace getting about 13% of the popular vote. And Nixon won. Nixon won in the Electoral College. But he certainly had no mandate. He'd run essentially a negative campaign, and he really didn't have a mandate through the election to do much of anything. In addition, Nixon faced a strongly Democratic Congress when he assumed power in January of 1969. And though he promised to unite us as Americans, Nixon's politics really rested on exploiting the deep divisions that cleaved American society at the time. With Nixon posing as the protector of the silent majority of patriotic, hardworking Americans against the anarchic forces of the militant radicals one saw all the time on TV. Anti-war activists, black power activists, hippies, and feminists. And we'll pause it here and come back in just a minute.